There is a piece of Russian land that exists about 150 miles away from the rest of Russia. And that piece of land is called Kaliningrad. It is surrounded by Lithuania, Belarus, and Poland, and it borders the Baltic Sea. But historically, this region was known as Konigsberg, and it was a part of a German-speaking region in East Prussia. It was a large city, it was also the capital and the greatest seat of military power in the Prussian Empire. If you want my little intro on Prussia, you should watch my previous post, which I captioned here. At least it was the Prussian seat of power until Frederick I moved it over to Berlin. But it was still the most heavily fortified region in the empire because they had to deal with Poland and Russia. Konigsberg did not just produce great military minds, it also produced some of the best philosophers in European history, one of them being Immanuel Kant. Its older history is similar to the rest of Prussia's. It used to be a region held by the Teutonic Knights, and then it got absorbed by the Polish and Lithuanians, and then it became part of the Prussian Empire. Like I said, it was that seat of power. Now, Konigsberg remained a part of the German Empire when everyone was unified in 1871, and it stayed a part of Germany after World War I. But when World War II concluded, that piece of land was taken from the Germans and brought directly into the Soviet Union. Once the Soviets were able to take Konigsberg, they changed the name to Kaliningrad, named after Mikhail Kalinin, who was one of the big administrative heads during the Soviet Union's formation. He was one of the great leaders of the Soviet Union in paper, and he was pretty much used as a figurehead to justify Stalin's really brutal actions, especially his purges. But we all know the Russians don't like to just change names, they like to kick out the entire native population and fill it with their own people, and that is exactly what happened to Kaliningrad. The Germans were just forcibly removed, replaced with Russians. And you might be wondering, how come when the Soviet Union fell, Kaliningrad still remained a part of Russia? Why couldn't it be its own country or part of Lithuania? That's because the deal that was worked out with the Germans at the conclusion of World War II said that Konigsberg or Kaliningrad was specifically Russian territory, not a republic, not a Soviet state. So in order for a Russian to get from the mainland, they would have to drive that 150 miles or 300 kilometers through Belarus and Lithuania. And it is the most militarily fortified region in Europe, if not the entire world, because Kaliningrad would be Russia's staging ground for an all-out missile assault if war ever did break out with the rest of NATO. And that is why there is a very heavily fortified piece of land called Russia that is actually over 100 miles away from the mainland. The location of Kaliningrad is ideal for Russian missiles to launch and strike a radius of NATO cities if the need ever arises. It is also the location of Russia's Baltic fleet, which consists of about 52 warships, and don't forget, a lot of these warships are armed with Iskander missiles. Some of them are nuclear capable. The Russians have their own little joke about Kaliningrad. They call it their own unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of Europe. And that's funny because the only aircraft carrier that the Russians were able to make is the Rostov, and that has been rotting in a dock since about 2018. But that region isn't the most fortified just by Russian troops. It is also the most heavily fortified NATO region on the planet. It is heavily fortified with Polish troops, Lithuanian troops, and overall NATO troops. There are at least 10,000 American troops that border both sides of Kaliningrad in Lithuania and Poland. Now, what I've just told you about Kaliningrad being an ideal staging location to take out a lot of NATO cities does have some validity, but we can't leave out the fact that Kaliningrad is also now surrounded by NATO countries that want an excuse to hurt Russia. What a lot of people like to talk about is that there is this gap from Belarus to Kaliningrad that would cut off the Baltic states from the rest of their NATO allies, but who cares? There's not enough firepower in Kaliningrad to withstand an assault from all the Baltic states, the Finnish, the Swedish, the Norwegians, and the Germans, along with this part of the Polish coast against an all-out assault to take out Kaliningrad's power. The Scandinavian countries alone have total naval supremacy when it comes to Arctic warfare. Then let's not forget Poland, which has the third largest army in all of NATO, right behind the United States and Turkey. They could easily push through a lot of resistance that this little piece of land had to offer them. I highly suggest reading this article, Kaliningrad, Impregnable Fortress or Russian Alamo. Now maybe Kaliningrad would have been a great tip of the spear for any kind of Soviet assault when the Baltic countries were a part of the Soviet Union, and of course Poland, Ukraine, bunch of other Eastern European countries were in the Soviet sphere of influence. Right now, Kaliningrad is just one small, isolated, though heavily fortified fortress. with very little chances of getting any kind of reinforcement if an assault ever happened. But of course, that doesn't stop Russia from trying to ruffle Poland, Lithuania, and all of NATO's feathers by having a lot of military exercises in that area. The question is, how much longer can Russia hold on to Kaliningrad while that country is cut off by a variety of sanctions that Russia can't easily thwart? Their economy is already suffering. I am the Geo Husar, and if Kaliningrad is ever freed from Russia, who should it go to? Poland, Lithuania? Should it be split, or should it become its own independent republic? Thanks for watching.